I'd just like to introduce the panel to you. So we've got scientist, artist. So we've got Helga Timko, who is a researcher at Cern. We've got James Bridle, who's an artist in the show. We've got Tara Shears, who's a physicist both at Cern and in Liverpool, and has also been very much involved in the process of art at Cern. And then finally, we've got Juan Cortez, who's again another artist. So I'd just like to go let you introduce yourselves, really, with the question of who are you and why you're here.
Okay, very briefly. So I'm Helga Timko. I work at Cern for 10 years now. And originally I've been studying theoretical particle physics, but I ended up doing accelerator research, so where I'm also doing everything from theory over simulations to experiments. And I'm working for the world's largest collider, the LHC. And I've been a scientific partner of Yoon-Chul Kim, whom you saw in the last session. So
Okay.
that's why I'm here.
Sure. Okay, James.
Hi, I'm James. I don't know, is it the opposite trajectory or something different? I actually trained as a computer scientist and somehow ended up in art. So I've gone in sort of completely the opposite direction to kind of going to becoming, I don't know, more experimental probably than you can be in computer science. Anyway, that was one of the things. So I got to go to Cern in 2016, just for a couple of days. We got to have amazing conversations with some of the scientists there, and actually particularly with the computer scientists. One of the most interesting things was, like, I'm fascinated by a lot of the physics, though, as we all know, and as we all keep saying, it's very hard to grasp as a kind of non-practitioner. So, as with most things, my way into it was kind of understanding these huge machines that they have and thinking, if I could just grasp little bits of that, then I can that can be my way into it. And after that, I became fascinated with this process of experimentation as it's practiced, the kind of the practical qualities of that, and also the divide between that and theoretical physics that I think you sort of hinted at there, which felt to me like this huge divide. On the one hand, you have people building these huge machines to test these theories, kind of like empiricism as heavy engineering, and on the other hand, you have people who are sort of like just imagining, just in the mind, and how ideas move back and forth between those spaces was super interesting. And my work that's in the show here responds to that to some extent, sort of asking what happens when you've computed out everything you do, and you have to make some other form of thought or some other kind of thinking that's necessary to kind of move our experimentation or our thinking or just our way of seeing forward in some way. And that's an ongoing and kind of fascinating process.
Okay, thank you. Tara?
So I'm Tara. I'm an experimental particle physicist. So I work on one of the experiments at the Large Hadron Collider, LHCb, and what I do in my day job when I'm not working at the University of Liverpool and teaching and doing admin and things like that is I am sifting through the data, looking for patterns, trying to picture and understand the behavior of particles so small that I have no hope ever of seeing them. And yet, through my imagination and through our established roots of scientific reasoning and our scientific language, we try to make sense of this, and we build it into a theory and an understanding, and it's my job always to try and test this understanding, if it's still valid, if I can break it, and so forth. And my role here is not just as a member of Cern, but also because I'm so interested in this whole process, this whole collision between art and science. And I've been fortunate enough to have conversations with Yoon-Chul and Yu Chen. And all of the comments that have been coming up about how immersive it is going to CERN, how difficult it is to get your head around it, I echo that from a scientist's point of view. It takes us years, and it's a continual process. So I identify very much with what you've been saying. And so does Helga.
I agree with that.
It's a universal thing. So I think perhaps our experiences are maybe not so disparate as people might think. So I'll leave you with that.
Hi, how are you? My name is Juan Cortez. I come from Colombia. I did a proposal for the Collide International Award, and they gave me the honorary mention. And then I spoke with Monica and Jose Carlos, and they were interested in a work for the exhibition. And I did work with my studio in Colombia, which is called Attractor, with the collaboration of Hyphen Hop in New York, related to dark matter. And yeah, and I work in Colombia in education. I work with public schools, and I'm interested in the relationship between art and education and creation and public education mostly.
Okay, so we're looking at the sort of major themes that came out of the whole project. So there's all sorts of things, like there's I think one of the most fundamental places to begin with is how the relationship between art and science has evolved. What is that relationship? What are the similarities and differences between the two practices, and what's the most interesting ways in which they can exchange knowledge and activity? Do you want to just respond to that?
I think I'd like to start with the similarities. For me, the keyword is creation, I think. And this is the same process whether you're a scientist, I believe, or artist. You have to create something new. And in fact, when I was in university, everything seemed so logical. Everything was already written in books, and they said this is the way it is, and it's a law. But when you then actually start to work as a physicist, you realize that you have to think about something that's not yet written in the book, and you have to find out, and it's all this process of exploring something, and it's really, and then finding also the philosophical, let's say, fundament of what it implies actually. That
so
equation
both,
or
both
that
about
thought.
creativity
Yes.
and about uncertainty. So that's
Yes.
quite interesting. What about you, James?
Yeah, I mean, it's the persistent problem that I kind of address in my work is this separation, not necessarily between art and science as a kind of as disciplines, but really as kind of people's idea of what it's kind of possible to participate in, or what the relationship is between them, and particularly to break down the kind of barriers of entry to them, to not see these as being kind of particularly as kind of enclosed, specialized disciplines that only certain people are allowed to practice. That you necessarily need some kind of particular background or training to be involved in discussions around the implications of these things. And I think you see that play out both kind of across the art-science divide and from people who are kind of outside these disciplines, who feel that they're not, you know, that they have no way of kind of participating in the discussions that they invoke. And so, again, within both disciplines, you get this kind of persistent conversation that happens of what is the duty of practitioners, or at least the people who do feel that they have the voice to actually communicate what it is that they're learning. There's also this idea, I think, on both sides that the other is kind of magic in some way. You know, like there's particularly when you get into discussions of technology and science or art, that like art will sort of magically be able to explain science by transforming it into something sort of more accessible, or, which I'm not sure about. Like I think it's important to kind of keep the dialogue up on kind of both sides of this, to say there's nothing within this that people can't understand, because often the temptation is to kind of simplify it, or to make it to something so kind of completely wondrous that you're kind of lost in awe, rather than actually having any kind of ability to think with these things that we can learn from both. So yeah, it feels like that. It brings up those tensions in a really nice way, but not in a way that you want to kind of let them settle on either side.
So to me, the similarities are that they're both a process of exploration for me. Science is, art is, it's all a process of making sense of what's around you and making sense of where your place is in that place around you. I mean, the methods we use are the differences. I think our languages are different, our techniques are different, but the basic underlying urge to do this, it comes from exactly the same place, because we're human. After all, everyone's human. So what you're saying about not dumbing it down too much and not not thinking that if we're presented from the other side, so if I'm a scientist and I'm presented with an artwork, my reaction should be wow, and vice versa. I think that's really important, because you get so much more out of everything with more understanding of what's going on, and more appreciation and a deeper appreciation. It's fine looking out of the window and it being a nice day, but if you know what makes it look like that, if you know why the sun is shining, why the sky is blue, why the clouds are formed in the way they have, it's a whole extra level of wonder. You still get that wonder. And so I'm going off at tangents here, but there are many, many similarities in our approach, I think, even if our end products probably are different and are interpreted differently, and our way of getting there is different. But I think our basic idea in wanting to go there comes from exactly the same place.
I guess a short answer is that I think both fields are enabling you to ask questions in a world that seems to not encourage you to ask questions, or that seems to have everything resolved. But the possibility to question things, it's for me very important for us as humans.
I suppose illustration and explanation are important things that artists are involved in, but it seemed something that came up in the first panel was the idea of your role as criticality and relating science to wider culture rather than just a straightforward explanation of some kind. Could you sort of respond to that?
I guess it's for me what I find interesting about art is that it allows you to question things, and in relation to science is not just a way to put like the materiality what you were saying, but to find the possibility of a different rationality. Like there's not just one path, there's not just one rationality, but multiple rationalities. Yeah. And I find like in art a possibility of a different path towards a rationality.
Right, different narratives, different. Yeah, okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, one of the starting points for the work over here, which is at its simplest level, basically a thing for generating random numbers, was a machine called the Clouterion, which used to stand in the center of Athens, which was a machine for choosing who was in charge. Because in the early Athenian democracy, they didn't use elections, they used sortition, which is essentially choosing people at random from the admittedly limited, mostly male landowning class to be in charge of the city. But they chose them at random through this big machine where they fed balls into the top and had people put their ID cards basically into it, and whoever's came out was in charge of the city. It was like a mathematical computational process, but yet because it stood in the center of the city, it was kind of visible to everyone, right? So there was a kind of legibility to the wider society on how this process that governed everyone worked. That to me is part of this idea of like making processes visible that allows everyone to participate in them, but specifically that it also leads you to really interesting social conclusions. So there's a lot of arguments from the social sciences now to bring back sortition in various forms, because it turns out that actually if you have more people from a wider selection of backgrounds addressing complex general problems, you get better results than just putting the people who are smarter according to certain tests in charge. So these results kind of permeate through stuff. And the final part of that is like that's also a huge part of my interest in certain people who address quantum physics, people like particularly Karen Barad, who I know has been important to several of the works in this show, who really stresses the ethical implications of science, that this is not something that that merely like produces scientific results, it actually produces social and political results that can be applied across society. So I don't think it's just artists' role to bring that forward. I think scientists and everyone can speak to that as well.
Yeah. And the fact that we've split into these two cultures, as C.P. Snow thought of them, is we don't see that wider aspect of, say, the political or the scientifically objective. We're kind of split, and only a few of us can see one part of the landscape, as it were. Okay, so you mentioned the invisible there, and I think that is a very strong theme throughout the show and throughout the process of the residencies. So things are invisible because they're behind closed doors, things are invisible because they're tiny. Things are invisible because they have no correlation with our everyday experience, and they're invisible because they're abstract. So I was wondering, so one thing that has already been mentioned is the public doesn't see you only for a tiny fraction, and maybe they get a rather skewed view of what a scientist or an artist is. So they think scientists calculate stuff and they always know what's going on, whereas it seems that you're always behind the scenes. You're always immersed in doubt and uncertainty, and maybe that doubt and uncertainty is something you share in the arts as well. So, you know.
Yeah, I imagine that when people hear scientists, they think of mathematics and calculations and all these things, but this is just somehow the surface, and I think what's underneath there is just the human nature of questioning ourselves all the time, and in fact it's the whole opposite of knowing everything. It's questioning all the time whether even myself and my own statement is this actually correct, and or does it only hold for in a limited, let's say, setup. And
how do you think you can get the public to connect with that uncertainty? That's a tough one.
It's maybe one way to think about it, and correct me if you don't agree, is that science is like exploration. It's like an adventure. It's like going out somewhere where you've never explored, where you don't have a map, where you want to get to the highest mountain where you're not even sure that there is a mountain. You have to work out how you find a map, how you make a map. You have to make your map to get you to where you want. You have to work out if what you want to get to actually exists, or whether it's meaningful. You can take nothing for granted. So as scientists, it's not like you are working from a textbook and just filling in gaps. Far from it. You're having to work out from the truth that your theory places out there in the universe. You have to interpret it, you have to work out how to test it, you have to work out how far you can say it's valid. It's like waking up in the morning with a blindfold on, with your earplugs in, and shuffling around a foreign hotel room trying to work out what's going on 3 miles away. With practice, you can pick up on things and get used to it. But that's the sort of process that we go through, and I think that sort of unknowingness, but having to make sense of it, is quite universal, really.
Do you artists sort of feel like something similar?
I have a very interesting story that I read, and is that in a book of Bruno Latour, he was trying to explain about this diffuse border between culture and science, and it's through this history. So Galileo was trying to find when he found the motion of the planets, like the path that the planets had and the relationship. He was trying to find a way to explain people that the planets had this motion and that were connected in some way, and he did he explained through angels, like the angels could have a relationship between something that's in the sky and something that's in the earth. So you can say that Galileo's physics is angelomorphic in a way, and that diffuse border between the culture and science and all the, like, you know, where the things start crossing. That's what I find interesting behind all of this. So I think, for me, the one interesting place of this conversation is the boundaries.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So,
yeah, I mean, this question of the unknown is, or the uncertain, seems to me absolutely kind of central to the present moment, in the sense that I think artists and theoretical, any kind of advanced physicist, and kind of quantum physics itself are the only disciplines that are comfortable, like, even really thinking about uncertainty and the unknown, or specifically unknowingness, because those are really hard things to think about, and they require a huge amount of kind of gentle easing in or training in order to deal with it. But I constantly think more and more at the moment that the generalized inability to deal with uncertainty, to deal with unknowingness, or our lack of ability to know about the world is a kind of fundamental problem of society at present. Uncertainty and unknowing produces in most of us feelings of kind of fear, occasionally anger, or just apathy, all of which are like fairly constitutional to the global order right now, because the world is being increasingly revealed through our sciences, through our politics, through everything else, as being undeniably complex and extraordinary and wonderful and amazing. But this desire to explain it often makes us fall into kind of quite difficult, complex cognitive traps. That leads to a lot of really kind of bad social behavior. So what fascinates me is the ability, I think, of both artists and the advanced sciences to stay comfortable with that uncertainty and that unknowing, to kind of find some place of agency within it that doesn't imply kind of hammering it down all the time, but kind of keeping this door open to kind of thinking exploration without a kind of paralysis that's all too easy.
Right.
And there's also a notion of concreteness as well that came up in the previous discussion, and the comments that both artists and scientists were comfortable, in a sense, living in their own mind, and being familiar enough with unseen concepts to know what you're working towards, even if you can't hold them in front of you. And that's all wrapped up as well in this idea of knowledge and uncertainty, but also having a grasp on the relative scales of things, the relative importances of things. It's another way of having knowledge. It's an untouchable knowledge, but almost like an intuitive knowledge. And I think that applies to us all as well.
So we've got 2 minutes. Okay. So I was quite interested in the how unknowable these phenomena are, and it's not just that they are like an insect hidden under a piece of paper. They are truly fundamentally unknowable in some sense, except through these amazing machines that we make to see in a different way. I was wondering about that, what you feel about that making, and both artists and scientists make machines. A digital media artist remediates through the digital and creates a new form of knowing through that. So I wonder if you could respond to that.
I have something that comes to my mind when you ask about this. I cannot quantify how much, but certainly one thing that I learned myself as well as physicist when I came to CERN was that I'm so tiny compared to the whole of CERN, and it's only together that we can do this, and none of us can know everything. And I think this relates also to your previous question somehow, is we've been talking about the barrier of language. And even for us scientists, there is a barrier of language when we come to CERN, so many abbreviations, so many special terms. And when we start to overcome this barrier of language and learn to communicate with each other, then we can start to work together, and it's just much more efficient when we start to have these conversations and think together than if I would just sit in my office and think in my corner alone.
Yeah, it's a collaboration. Do you want to say something?
I wanted to echo that. The collaboration is what CERN is all about. It's a collaboration of many, many different types of skills and experiences that make it all possible. And like Helga, I know I'm a teensy tiny insignificant part of this, but I'm really glad and proud to be part of it because I am able to make some contribution through it, and that is thrilling to me and for all of us who work there. But your question for me also raised something else, and another debate that we haven't had at all, which is this notion of objectivity and subjectivity.
Exactly.
Which maybe we want to pick up in the questions. I mean, science is objective, we're humans and subjective, and so it's a continual struggle for us to make objective measurements and know that they're objective as well.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a good point to stop. And we mentioned language and abstraction, which is the the subject of the next panel. So we'll just go to questions now, please.
Thank you. Would anyone like to start off with a question? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for that. I actually have a question about a couple of specific things within work that's in the show, and it actually relates to the previous panel, to the Yunchul's piece and also James's piece. I got talking earlier. It's a question about randomness, and the randomness that's generated by your piece, James, and the randomness that's generated by Yunchul's piece. Is there a difference in kind in those randomness? One being constructed through a machine, and one being, I suppose, discovered through something coming from the universe that's well outside of the human. Is there a difference in kind in that randomness? And I suppose by extension, can our technology and our machines be understood to be nature? And I'll leave it there.
I really want to hear your guys' answer to the second part of that, but just to quickly say about the randomness of what my piece. I'm not entirely sure, and I don't want to speak for Yunchul's piece on how it works. My piece generates random numbers by taking environmental data. So they have sensors attached to them. They pull noise from the world around them, and they use that as the basis for a random number generator. So it's partly machine. It's generated, but based on what the machine thinks is nature, but how natural is the interior environment of a gallery in any case. It's deeply regulated in all these kind of ways. So it troubles that distinction quite deliberately between the kind of natural and the machine, and also there are these stupid little anthropomorphic things that make you feel kind of weird things on top of that as well. So there's constantly that tension between the things, I think, in this question, and also the fact that there's no such thing as randomness. It's an entirely it's essentially a construction of perception, and on top of that itself. But to what point we can conceive the machines as part of nature? I don't know. I mean, I'll hand over to you guys, but I mean, there is a strong sense to which the machines are part of our construction of nature in terms of the way in which we're capable of perceiving it. Like we can have no nature, no knowledge or thought of nature without its kind of perception through these machines as well. So I don't know to what extent it's useful to consider themselves to be as part of us or kind of external to us.
Maybe it's also related to an internal dilemma of physics itself, is that we are trying to, let's say, model nature and understand nature, but to do this, because it's too complex to model everything, you need to take out a piece or let's say, make the appropriate simplifications. And also when we model, for example, randomness, then you can quantify how random it is. Is it random enough for what you are studying, or do you need more randomness? So, yeah, it's to say that maybe the humans are too little to grasp everything at the same time, so we need to slice down things when we are looking into a certain direction or handling a certain question.
But we do build our machines under the assumption that the data they give us is a true representation of the innermost nature of the universe, in a sense. So the fundamental particles that we will identify, for example, in the data of the Large Hadron Collider, we assume are the fundamental particles present throughout the universe. And that is an assumption that underlies our entire science. We have assumed this universality there, and we have assumed that what we have temporarily manufactured in Geneva is representative of the whole. Now, I can't argue whether that's actually true or not. It is an assumption at the heart of our approach. But it is very much our approach that what we see in the machines is a reflection of the physical reality of the universe.
Sorry, I was... this goes to Juan, because I was having a conversation with you a while ago where you were talking, and that's connected to what you were just saying. And you were talking about the ancestral knowledge coming from the indigenous, from the Amazons, and how this is connected with what you are interested in CERN, which is what you were just talking about. That CERN looks at it as this is the actual fact, the reality of our knowledge. But what is the experience that you have coming from the study that you did with the indigenous groups on the Amazons?
Well, to make it a short answer, I think it's a matter of translation, as the machines that we are talking about are translating phenomena into things that we can measure and understand. I think there are another machines in the metaphorical way that you can find in the Amazon ancestral knowledge, like the river, for example, which is actually another way to understand the cosmogony of that culture. As for me, and I don't know if it's too risky to say this, like the Hadron Collider could be in a way another cosmogony machine to understand like the origin of our cosmogony as Western society. So I think it's a problem of a very interesting problem of translation, which is similar in both cultures. And I'm sorry to repeat again, but the interesting thing for me again is the possibility of different rationalities. And what makes interesting for me is that there are different paths and ways to reach to an answer.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I'm going to apologise for this question in advance because I'm not sure it makes sense. But over the course of this century, there's a suggestion we need to become, we do need to become a more ecological society, and that we'll move from an industrial society to an ecological society. How does CERN fit in with that ecological society? Because obviously we'll be a 21st century ecological society, not a 15th century pre-industrial society. So how does what you're learning and going through kind of compute with what might happen over the course of the next number of decades?
I'd say one thing is, of course, discovering particles, but behind that there is all the construction of enormous machines that are continuously trying to push the current technology. So when the machine is, let's say, conceived, when there's the idea of a new machine, we always design a machine that is not yet possible to build with the technology today. And by the time we get there in 10 or 20 years, we want to have that technology available. So in this sense, I think it's contributing to the advance of technology.
But CERN's also very ecologically aware. So there's huge power consumption in our experiments. So the LHC will use as much energy as the city of Geneva when it's operating, just to set the scale. But the reason, in a sense, it uses so little is because it's pushed technology to be able to develop superconducting magnets that are a really efficient way of reaching that energy. The technologies that are being developed at CERN have spun off to make more efficient solar cells, for example, that if you go to Geneva Airport, you can see them all deployed there. And they're more efficient thanks to the vacuum technology that's been developed for the accelerators. And if you have a greater vacuum in a solar cell, you get a better efficiency at translating the sunlight into electricity at the end. There's the fact that it's a worldwide collaboration, but we don't all have to travel by air to meet each other. We talk to each other through computers. We've developed new ways of communicating in order to make things possible more easily, bearing in mind that people may not want to travel or cannot afford to travel. And in a small way, CERN also is trying to reduce the carbon footprint of its everyday operations as well. So it's giving us the future technologies that we need to make society more efficient, but it's also doing that and putting it into practice day to day as well.
So maybe I should add to that with the practices that we follow here in Liverpool. So I think scientific knowledge is fundamentally useless is useless. It comes with its own structure, okay, and nature comes out as it comes out. And Michael Faraday was asked what use is the electron, what use is magnetism, when he was talking in the time of steam engines and gas lights, and he said, what use is a newborn baby? And you don't get the modern world without Faraday, okay? But that process of getting from Faraday to mobile phones and the internet and CERN is another story. It's another practice of taking this knowledge in these silos and contextualizing it into culture in a useful and beneficial way. And so that's the way I see it. And that's why I think it's such a valuable thing to have these relationships in all sorts of dimensions between all sorts of practitioners.
And the clouds experiment, right? Because that has a direct impact on the models of the future climate.
We've got a couple more minutes if there's any other questions.
Hi, I just wanted to pick up on Tara's mention of subjectivity and objectivity. So I was reading about a study of cosmological science papers over 10 years that showed that the statistics of the results were too good to be true. And so I wanted to ask about confirmation bias, about the fact that maybe we find what we're looking for. So that's kind of a question to the physicists, but I think the artists might also have something to say.
So you've picked up on our worst nightmares. So if you're in the business of trying to make objective measurements of what's out there, then you really don't want any form of bias. And yet quantifying that you have bias is the hardest thing, because we're a mass of biases, and actually identifying them is hard enough, let alone quantifying them. So we have various practices in place when we interpret our experimental data to just try and minimize the possibility of that. So, for example, we have processes that we call blinding data, where you introduce a random number and you multiply it by your data. You carry out your entire analysis to make a measurement of something that's going to tell you something fundamental, and only at the end, once you're satisfied that it's all correct, do you then unblind and look to see what you have. And in that way, we hope to get away from occasionally seeing something that looks promising and where we want to end up, and unconsciously nudging our data analysis towards it. Now, of course, that's not infallible, and studies like you've mentioned can point out the fact that things aren't infallible afterwards. So we're developing more and more sophisticated statistical techniques to just try and identify that happening at the time. So it's a continuous, ongoing battle to try and remove it as much as possible. So all I can say is we know it's a possibility. We try not to let it happen. We try to identify when it does happen, but we never let up because we know it always could, if that makes sense.
I'm under strict orders to keep to time, so I'm very sorry, but we're going to draw that second panel to a close so we can move on to the third one. But can we thank all of our guests on the panel?